Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a kitchen table covered in envelopes. Not bills scattered everywhere in a panic, just envelopes, neat ones, each one labelled in careful handwriting, sitting beside a coffee cup that has gone lukewarm because the conversation at that table mattered more than the coffee did. We're talking about 1950s America, and specifically, how families actually managed their money before credit cards existed. No swiping, no tapping, just cash, patience, and a kind of quiet discipline that shaped an entire generation. Before we get into it, thank you so much to the viewer who suggested this one. You always send me the ideas that make me stop and think, and this topic has been sitting with me for weeks. If you enjoy this kind of thing, a like and a comment genuinely help more than you know, and if you would rather listen than watch, we're also on Spotify now, so feel free to find us there through the link in the description. No pressure either way. I am just glad you're here. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe put a fan on for that soft hum in the background. Settle into whatever blanket or chair feels like home tonight, because we're going to be here for a while. What did it actually feel like to open a pay envelope on a Friday afternoon in 1955? What did it sound like when coins were counted out onto a kitchen table, one by one, into little jars with handwritten labels? What did a family do when something unexpected broke, when there was no plastic card to soften the blow, only what was already saved? What did it feel like to walk into a bank and know the manager by name? And just like that, it is 1955. The pay envelope is already on the counter. Someone is counting change into a coffee tin, and the week is just beginning. Let's start with the end of the work week. Friday afternoon arrives quietly, the way it always does, but there is a small ritual waiting at the end of it. Your husband walks through the door, sets his hat on the hook, and hands over a paper envelope, still slightly warm from being carried close. Inside is cash, counted out to the dollar, sometimes down to the coin. There is no number on a screen to check, no balance to glance at, just paper and coin in your hand, the whole week's worth of labour made suddenly, physically real. You hold it for a moment before opening it, the way you might hold a letter before reading it, because in a sense that is exactly what it is. It carries the shape of the week inside it. The early mornings, the overtime he mentioned only once in passing on Tuesday, the tired way he sat down to dinner on Wednesday without saying much at all. All of it is folded into this small paper envelope, and you can feel the weight of it before you even count what's inside. The kitchen is warm behind you, the smell of something simmering low on the stove, and the radio hums softly from the other room. A voice reading the evening news to no one in particular. Your husband loosens his tie and sinks into his chair with the particular exhale of a man who has finished something. You set the envelope on the counter beside the sugar tin, not opening it just yet, because there is a rhythm to this evening and it does not begin with money. It begins with supper, with a clatter of plates, with someone asking how the day went and someone else answering honestly, or as honestly as tiredness allows. It is only after the dishes are cleared, after the children have wandered off to whatever quiet mischief occupies a Friday evening, that the envelope finally gets opened. The paper crinkles softly under your fingers, worn thin at the fold from being carried in a coat pocket all day. Inside, the bills are neat, pressed flat, arranged the way a teller arranges them, largest to smallest, and beneath them a few coins that click gently against the counter when you tip them out. You count it once, quietly, moving your lips the way you always have since you were a girl learning arithmetic at a wooden desk. Then you count it again, not because you doubt the number, but because counting it twice feels like giving it the respect it deserves. This is not abstract money. This is a week of your husband's hands on machinery, his voice on the phone with difficult customers, his patience worn a little thinner with every passing hour on the floor. You know this because you've seen the way his shoulders sit at the end of a long shift, the particular stiffness that settles into a man who's been standing for 8 hours straight. There is something almost reverent about handling cash this way, feeling its texture, its slight give, the way it can be creased and folded and still hold its value entirely. It does not vanish quietly into a machine somewhere, unseen and unfelt. It sits in your palm, tangible, and every dollar you set aside for rent or coal or Sunday's collection plate is a dollar you've physically touched and considered. Outside, the neighbourhood settles into its own version of Friday evening. A door closes down the block. Someone's radio drifts faintly through an open window, a big band tune fading in and out with the breeze. The streetlights have not yet come on, though the sky's beginning to soften into that particular shade of orange that only appears at the end of a long week, as if even the sun understands that Friday deserves a little ceremony. You slide the envelope into the drawer where it will wait until tomorrow, when the real work of dividing it begins. For tonight it is enough to know it arrived, that it is whole, that the numbers matched what they were supposed to. There is a peace in that simplicity, a peace that comes from money you can hold rather than money you can only imagine. Your husband glances over from his chair, catching your eye for just a moment. Neither of you says anything about it. You don't need to. This exchange, small and wordless, has happened every Friday for years, and it will happen again next week, and the week after that, steady as the seasons. It is the quiet backbone of a household, this envelope, this ritual, this simple act of trust between two people who have learned to build a life out of careful, honest counting. And as the evening deepens and the kitchen light dims to something softer, you think, not for the first time, that there is a kind of security in this that no bank statement could ever fully replace. It is Friday evening now, and the kitchen table has become something like a small office. You spread the money out in front of you, sorting it the way you have every week for years. Bills for the landlord in one pile, coins for the milkman in another, a little folded aside for the electric company, due at the end of the month. There is a rhythm to it, almost meditative, the soft sound of paper sliding against paper. The overhead light hangs low over the table, warm and yellow, casting a small circle of brightness onto the oilcloth cover beneath your hands. Everything outside that circle fades into the comfortable dimness of the rest of the kitchen, the stove cooling from dinner, the dish towel hung neatly over its hook, the faint tick of the clock on the wall marking time in patient, unhurried beats. This is your workspace tonight, no larger than the tablecloth itself, but it holds the entire shape of your family's week. You begin, as you always do, with the largest bills first, smoothing each one flat with the side of your hand before setting it into its designated pile. The landlord's portion goes furthest from you, closest to the notebook where it will be recorded the moment it is set aside, because money that is not written down has a way of quietly disappearing into smaller, less important purchases. Beside it, a stack for the electric company, thinner than you would like, but enough. Then groceries, counted twice, because groceries are the pile most likely to shrink without permission if you're not careful. The coins come next, and this is the part your youngest likes to help with, when she's not already off somewhere chasing fireflies in the last of the evening light. Nickels and dimes sorted into small towers, then swept into a chipped teacup reserved for exactly this purpose. The milkman's coins live in that cup until Monday morning, when they will be left on the step beside the empty glass bottles, a small transaction repeated so many times it barely requires thought anymore. There is something satisfying in seeing it all laid out this way, visible, countable, honest. Nothing is hidden in this system. Nothing is deferred to a future version of yourself who will somehow, magically, have more. What is on the table is what exists, and what exists must be divided carefully enough to last until the next Friday brings more. You glance at the notebook open beside you, its pages soft at the corners from years of handling. Last week's entries sit above this week's blank line, a quiet record of a life measured in small, careful numbers. Rent, $11, coal, $2.50, Sunday's collection, 50 cents. You add tonight's figures beneath them in the same careful hand your mother once used at her own kitchen table, in her own small circle of lamplight, dividing her own week's earnings the same patient way. Your husband sits nearby, not helping exactly, but present, flipping through the evening paper with one ear tuned to the soft sounds of your counting. Every so often he glances over, and you tell him without being asked whether the week has left anything extra, whether Saturday might allow for something small, an ice cream after church perhaps, or a new spool of thread for the mending pile. He nods, satisfied, trusting the numbers because he trusts you, and because this arrangement has worked for as long as either of you can remember. The piles grow neater as the minutes pass. Rent moves to its envelope in the drawer. Electric follows. Groceries are folded into a smaller envelope you will carry to the store tomorrow morning, exact enough that you rarely need to ask the grocer to adjust the tally. What remains, modest as it is, gets tucked into the household's small savings envelope, the one reserved for emergencies, for Christmas, for anything the future might quietly demand of you. Outside the window, the sky has deepened to a soft, bruised purple, and somewhere down the street a screen door bangs twice. A child called in for the night. The kitchen smells faintly of the roast that filled it an hour earlier, mingling now with the plain paper scent of dollar bills and the metallic hush of coins settling into their cup. It is a smell you have come to associate, without quite realizing it, with safety. By the time you close the notebook, the table has returned to its ordinary self, cleared of everything but a coffee cup and the evening paper. But you know, as you rise to put the kettle on, that the work of the evening has done something larger than simply divide a paycheck. It has, once again, held the whole family together for one more week, penny by careful penny, without a single dollar owed to anyone who did not already know your name. There is no drama in it, no urgency, just the same quiet arithmetic repeated every Friday, the kind that asks for nothing more than attention and honesty, and gives back, in return, a kind of peace that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never sat at a table exactly like this one. This is the method most households leaned on, and it is worth understanding properly. You keep a stack of envelopes in a kitchen drawer, each one labelled by hand: rent, groceries, coal, shoes, church. Every payday you divide the cash among them, and once an envelope is empty, that spending simply stops until the next payday arrives. There is no borrowing from one envelope to feed another, not if you can help it. It is the kind of discipline that is harder to imagine now. The drawer itself is nothing special, second from the top, sticking slightly in humid weather, the same drawer that has held these envelopes for as long as you have kept this house. Inside they sit in a neat row, edges worn soft from handling, the ink of their labels faded just enough to show how many years they have served this exact purpose. You did not invent this system. Your mother used it before you, and her mother before that, each generation passing down not just the method, but the specific, careful handwriting that marks each envelope's purpose. Rent sits at the front, always, because it is the obligation that cannot bend. Then groceries, thick with use, refilled more often than any other. Coal, thinner in summer, swelling again as autumn approaches and the evenings grow sharp enough to need it. Shoes, a small envelope, patient, sometimes going months without a single bill inside it, until a child's toe finally pushes through canvas and announces that patience has run its course. And church, steady, unchanging, the same modest amount set aside every single week, regardless of what else the month has demanded. When payday arrives, you sit with all of them spread before you like a hand of cards, deciding not what you want to spend, but what has already been decided for you by the shape of your life. Rent takes what it takes. Groceries take what they take. What remains, however small, gets distributed among the rest, sometimes requiring difficult choices, a few dollars pulled from shoes to top off coal because the weather turned colder sooner than expected this year. The genius of the system, if you can call it genius, is its honesty. An empty envelope cannot lie to you. It cannot pretend there is money where there is none. If groceries runs dry 3 days before payday, you know it immediately, and you adjust, perhaps a simpler supper, perhaps a visit to the cellar for potatoes put up back in autumn, rather than reaching into church or coal to cover the gap. The envelopes hold you accountable in a way no promise to yourself ever quite manages to. There is a kind of comfort in the physical nature of it too. You can hold rent in your hand and know, by its thickness, whether the month is going to be an easy one or a tight one. You do not need to do arithmetic in your head at the grocer's counter, worrying whether you have enough, because the envelope in your handbag tells you plainly. In bills you can count with your fingers before you even reach the register. Your children have grown up watching this ritual, watching you sort and label and divide, and in their own small ways they have begun to understand it. Your eldest keeps a tin under her bed divided into her own makeshift sections, penny by penny, allowance carefully split between saving and spending, mimicking the drawer downstairs without anyone needing to explain why. It is simply how money works, as far as she's ever known, and there is something reassuring in watching a lesson take root without a single lecture required. Neighbours keep their own versions of this same system, their own drawers, their own labelled envelopes, though the categories shift slightly from house to house, depending on what each family's life demands. The Hendersons down the block keep one marked Doctor, fed steadily against the day one of their 4 boys inevitably breaks something climbing a fence he'd been told, repeatedly, not to climb. The widow 2 doors down keeps one simply marked Kindness, a small reserve she uses to help whichever neighbour seems to need it most that month, never announced, never expected to be repaid. By the time the next payday arrives, the envelopes have thinned considerably, some nearly flat, others holding onto $1 or 2 of stubborn surplus. You empty what remains into the notebook's final tally, note it carefully, and begin the process again, refilling each one according to the same order, the same careful hand, the same unspoken agreement between you and the paper that holds your family's plans. It is not a glamorous system. It will never appear in any bank's advertisement or any polished pamphlet promising financial freedom. But it works because it asks nothing of you except honesty, and it gives back, every single week, the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where you stand, envelope by envelope, dollar by careful dollar. Let's walk down to the corner store for a moment. The grocer knows your face, your family, and often your husband's schedule better than you'd expect. Many families kept a running tab there, paid off in full on payday, written down in a small notebook behind the counter in the grocer's own handwriting. It worked because trust worked. Everybody in the neighbourhood knew everybody's business, in the gentlest sense of the phrase. The bell above the door announces you the moment you step inside, a small brass sound that has greeted this same doorway for decades. The smell hits you first, always, a particular mix of sawdust on the floor, the sharp sweetness of fresh produce stacked in wooden crates, and something baking somewhere in the back that you have never quite identified, but always associate with this exact store and no other. Mr. Kowalski looks up from behind the counter, already reaching for his notebook before you've said a word, because he has seen your face come through that door every Tuesday and Friday for the past 6 years, and he knows, roughly, what you'll need before you know it yourself. You move through the narrow aisles with a list folded in your coat pocket, though you rarely need to consult it. Flour, a pound of butter, whatever vegetables look freshest today, which this time of year means turnips and the last stubborn cabbages of the season. You pick up a tin of coffee, hesitate, then set it back, remembering the coffee tin at home still has enough for another week if you're careful with it. At the counter, Mr. Kowalski totals everything not with a register, but with a stub of pencil against the edge of his notebook, murmuring the numbers aloud as he writes them, a habit that has never once produced an error you've noticed. He does not ask for payment. He simply adds the total to the page bearing your family's name, a page that has grown thick with entries over the years, each one a small unspoken vote of confidence that you will make it right on Friday, the way you always have. This arrangement did not happen by accident. It was built slowly, over years, the way most trust is built, through small and unremarkable consistency. The first time you shopped here, newly married, nervous about asking for credit at all, he simply nodded and said that Friday would be fine, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. You've never given him reason to regret it, and in return he has never once made you feel small for needing it. There is a particular kind of dignity in this system that is easy to overlook. You're not filling out forms, you're not answering questions about your income or your husband's employment. You're simply a known face in a known neighbourhood, buying what your family needs, trusted to settle the account when the week's earnings arrive. It is credit in its truest and oldest sense, built entirely on character rather than paperwork. Other families in the neighbourhood carry their own pages in that same notebook, tucked behind the counter in a wooden box that has become something like a quiet ledger of the entire block's trust in one another. The Andersons 3 doors down, the Petrocellis above the shoe repair shop, old Mrs. Whitfield who pays hers off a little at a time, whatever her pension allows, and Mr. Kowalski never once rushes her, understanding that some weeks are simply harder than others. On Fridays the pattern reverses. You return not to buy, but to settle, counting out bills from your grocery envelope while Mr. Kowalski flips to your page, running his pencil down the week's entries, tallying them together with the same careful murmur. The amount rarely surprises you. You've been watching it grow all week, aware, the way you always are, of exactly how much your family has consumed and how much remains for the days ahead. He tears the settled page from the notebook once payment is made, a small ceremonial gesture, and begins a fresh one for the coming week, your family's name written once more at the top in his familiar slanted hand. There is something satisfying in watching a debt close cleanly like that, in seeing the page removed entirely rather than simply marked paid, as though the slate has been wiped honestly clean rather than merely noted as settled. Walking home afterward, your grocery bag heavier than your coin purse, you think about how strange this system might look to someone from outside the neighbourhood, how odd it might seem to trust a shopkeeper with an unpaid balance for days at a time. But here, it is simply how things work, woven so thoroughly into the rhythm of the week that it hardly feels like a system at all. It feels instead like something closer to community, measured out in flour, butter, and the quiet promise of Friday. Now it is Saturday morning, and there is somewhere to be. The bank on Main Street opens at 9, and there is often a small line already forming, neighbours nodding to one another, hats tipped politely. Inside, you're greeted not by a stranger behind glass, but by a manager who might know your name, your husband's job, and roughly how much you have managed to put away this year. The The morning air still carries a slight chill as you walk the 6 blocks downtown, your good coat buttoned against it, your handbag held a little more carefully than usual, aware of what it carries. The street is quieter than it will be later, the shops just beginning to open their shutters, a baker sweeping his stoop, a boy on a bicycle delivering the morning paper with the practiced arc of someone who has thrown it 1,000 times before. Saturday morning has its own particular texture, unhurried and purposeful all at once. The bank building itself is a solid, dignified structure, marble steps worn smooth in the centre, from decades of careful feet climbing them. Inside, the ceiling rises high overhead, and the sound of the room carries that particular hush that only banks and churches seem to manage, voices lowered instinctively, footsteps softened despite the hard floor. Brass fixtures gleam at every counter, polished each morning before the doors open, a small daily ritual performed by someone whose job it is to ensure the bank always looks worthy of the trust placed in it. You take your place in the short line, exchanging a quiet good morning with Mrs. Delacroix ahead of you, who mentions, as she always does, that her roses did not do well this year, blaming it on a summer that came in too hot too fast. Behind you, old Mr. Feeney shuffles forward with his familiar cane, here as he is every Saturday to check on the small account he's kept since before the war, a habit as fixed in his week as church on Sunday. When your turn comes, Mr. Whitcomb greets you by name before you've even reached the counter, a small courtesy that never fails to warm you slightly, no matter how many times it happens. He asks after your husband's shift at the plant, remembers, unprompted, that your eldest daughter had been unwell the week before, and asks how she's mending. This is not performance. He genuinely wants to know, the way a man who has served this same small stretch of Main Street for 20 years comes to feel less like a banker and more like an extension of the neighbourhood itself. You slide your small deposit across the counter, the modest surplus left over from this week's careful division, and he counts it with quick, practised fingers before recording it in your passbook, the small booklet that has tracked, in his own steady handwriting, every dollar you've managed to set aside since your wedding day. He hands it back to you, and you glance at the updated total, still small by any grand measure, but growing, slowly, the way a garden grows, one careful season at a time. There is no anonymity in this transaction, and that is precisely the point. Mr. Whitcomb knows that this money represents sacrifice, patience, 100 small decisions made instead of easier ones. He treats it accordingly, with the same seriousness he might show a much larger account, because to him, the size of the sum matters less than the character behind it. Outside the bank, the morning has fully woken now, Main Street humming gently with Saturday errands, the hardware store propping open its door, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery 2 doors down. You pause for a moment on the marble steps, passbook tucked safely back into your handbag, feeling the particular satisfaction that comes only once a week. This quiet proof that the family's careful counting has once again produced something real and growing. You think briefly of your daughter, still too young to understand any of this, and wonder what she will remember of these Saturday mornings when she is grown, whether she'll carry her own passbook to her own bank someday, greeted by her own version of Mr. Whitcomb, in a version of this same unhurried ritual. It is impossible to know for certain, but you hope quietly that some version of this patience survives long enough to reach her. As you make your way back up the street toward home, the day fully begun now around you, you carry with you not just an updated passbook, but something harder to name, a small steady confidence that comes from watching a modest sum grow slowly and honestly, dollar by dollar, Saturday by Saturday, under the watchful and familiar eye of a man who has never once treated your trust carelessly. It is worth pausing here on something many families quietly relied on, The Christmas Club, starting in January, a small amount, sometimes as little as 50 cents a week, was set aside specifically for the holidays. By December, it added up to something real, enough for gifts and a good dinner, without a single dollar of it ever touching a debt. The idea always struck you as a small kind of magic when you first heard of it, years ago from your own mother, who swore by it the way some people swear by prayer. You open the account in early January, the bank providing a small booklet with 52 lines printed neatly down its pages, one for every week of the year, waiting patiently to be filled. There is something almost hopeful about that empty booklet, the way it assumes, quietly and without pressure, that you will keep coming back week after week long before December ever arrives. The first deposit feels almost too small to matter, 50 cents slid across the counter, recorded carefully in its designated line. But you have learned, over the years, that this is exactly the point. 50 cents does not strain a household already stretched thin by rent and coal and shoes. It is small enough to never be missed, and yet steady enough that its absence from your weekly spending becomes, eventually, simply another fact of life, no different than the envelope set aside for Sunday's collection plate. Through the cold months of winter, you barely think of it. February passes, then March, the booklet sitting quietly in your handbag's inner pocket. Another line filled each Saturday during your regular visit to see Mr. Whitcomb. By spring, when the garden begins demanding your attention, and the household budget shifts to accommodate seed packets and canning jars, the Christmas Club continues its patient work in the background, 50 cents at a time, untouched by whatever else the season requires. Summer brings its own distractions, a birthday to plan for, a bit of extra spent on watermelon and lemonade for the children during the hottest weeks. But still the deposits continue, steady as a heartbeat. You have come to think of it almost as a separate, quieter member of the household, one that asks nothing of you beyond consistency and gives back, eventually, something the rest of the year cannot quite manage on its own. By autumn, the booklet is more than half filled, and you find yourself glancing at it more often now, doing the small arithmetic in your head, counting forward the remaining weeks until December, calculating roughly what the final total might allow. It is a pleasant kind of anticipation, different from the anxious counting that accompanies grocery money or rent. This money has one purpose only, and that singular purpose makes it feel, somehow, lighter to think about. When November arrives, the neighbourhood begins its own quiet countdown alongside yours. Mrs. Delacroix mentions her own Christmas Club total at the bank one Saturday, comparing notes the way women sometimes do. Not competitively, but companionably, each of you proud in your own modest way of what patient saving has produced. The grocer begins stocking tins of ribbon candy and boxes of dates, small signals that the season is turning, and you feel the Christmas Club booklet in your handbag with a slightly different weight now, closer to its purpose than it has been all year. Finally, in early December, the account matures, and you withdraw the full sum in a single satisfying transaction. The entire year's worth of 50-cent deposits transformed suddenly into something substantial enough to matter. Mr. Whitcomb counts it out for you with visible pleasure, as though he too has been quietly rooting for this moment since January, and in a way, perhaps he has. That money becomes the goose for Christmas dinner, a new sweater for your husband, a doll for your youngest that she has mentioned, longingly, every time you've passed the shop window since October. None of it costs you a debt. None of it requires a single dollar borrowed against a future you haven't yet earned. It is simply the patient result of 50 cents set aside faithfully week after week by a version of yourself back in January who trusted that December would come, as it always does, and that she would be glad when it arrived, to have been so quietly prepared for it, let's step into the department store downtown where a different kind of patience is on display. If you wanted something you could not yet afford in full, a coat, a radio, a pair of good shoes, you did not borrow the money. You put it on layaway instead, paying a little each visit until it was fully yours, and only then did you carry it home. The department store rises 3 full floors above Main Street, its windows dressed each season by a display artist whose work draws small crowds of admirers even when the store itself is closed. Today you have come specifically for the coat you spotted 2 weeks ago in the window, a deep wool navy, well made, the kind of coat that might last a decade if cared for properly. You cannot pay for it outright, not this week, not with Cole's envelope already thinner than you'd like heading into the cold months, but you can begin. The layaway counter sits toward the back of the second floor, staffed by a patient older woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who has clearly done this exact transaction thousands of times before, and somehow still manages to make each customer feel like the day's most important errand. You point to the coat still hanging on its rack nearby, and she nods, retrieves it carefully, and begins filling out a small card with your name, the item, its full price, and today's date. You hand over your first payment, modest but meaningful, and she records it neatly on the card before tucking the coat away into a back room reserved entirely for this purpose. A room you've never seen but imagine as something like a quiet closet of half-finished promises, coats and radios and Sunday shoes all waiting patiently for their owners to finish earning them. There is no interest added to what you owe, no fee tacked on for the privilege of paying slowly. The price agreed upon today remains exactly the price you will pay on your final visit, whether that comes in 3 weeks or 3 months. This feels somehow remarkably fair, a transaction built entirely on patience rather than profit, though you understand, of course, that the store benefits too, holding your money and your commitment both, trusting that you will return. Over the following weeks, you visit whenever the household budget allows a little extra, sometimes $2, sometimes only 50 cents when the week has been tight. Mrs. Abernathy greets you each time by name, retrieves your card from a small file box organised alphabetically, and records the new payment with the same careful attention she gave the first. The coat remains hanging in that back room the entire time, untouched by anyone else, reserved entirely for you the moment you complete the final payment. There is a particular kind of excitement in this slow accumulation, different from simply buying something outright. Each payment feels like a small victory, a visible measure of progress towards something you wanted enough to work steadily for. You find yourself, some weeks, deliberately setting aside a little extra specifically for this purpose, skipping a small treat here or there, because the coat has become, in its own modest way, a goal worth trimming other comforts for. By the time November arrives and the final payment is made, the coat feels different in your hands than it would have felt if you'd simply purchased it outright on that first day. Mrs. Abernathy retrieves it from the back room with something like ceremony, unwraps the protective paper, and holds it up for your inspection one final time before folding it carefully into a bag. You have earned this coat in the truest sense, dollar by patient dollar, and there is no small satisfaction in that. Walking home with the bag over your arm, the November wind sharp against your cheeks, you think about how different this feels from simply charging something and worrying about the bill later. There was no anxiety in the layaway process, no creeping dread of a statement arriving with numbers larger than you remembered. There was only patience, steady and unremarkable. The same patience that fills the envelopes in your kitchen drawer and the Christmas Club booklet in your handbag. Your husband notices the coat that evening, comments on its fine wool, asks gently how you managed it. You tell him about the weeks of small payments, the back room at the department store Mrs. Abernathy's careful record-keeping, and he nods, understanding immediately because this is simply how your household has always managed the things it wants but cannot yet afford. Not through borrowing, but through waiting, carefully and deliberately, until waiting is no longer necessary at all. Not every family trusted the bank completely, and it is gentle, not foolish, to admit that many kept a small reserve at home too. A cigar box tucked in the back of a closet, a coffee can on a high shelf, holding a little emergency cash that never touched a ledger. Let's talk about how families separated by distance managed things. If you had a son away at college or a relative in another state, sending money meant a money order from the post office, carefully filled out, or cash folded inside a letter and sealed twice for good measure. It travelled slower than we're used to now, but it travelled with intention. The post office sits 3 blocks from home, a squat brick building with a flag that snaps smartly in the wind most mornings. And today, you have come specifically for this purpose. Your son's tuition payment folded carefully in your handbag alongside a letter you finished writing just last night. He is 3 states away now, studying something that still sounds a little abstract to you no matter how many times he's explained it in his letters, and this small monthly errand has become, in its own way, one of your favourite tasks of the week. Inside, the postal clerk, a thin, careful man named Mr. Ostrowski, recognises the routine immediately when you approach his window. "Money order again?" he asks, already reaching for the appropriate form, and you nod, sliding the exact amount across the counter, along with a small additional fee for the service itself. He fills in the details with practiced precision, your son's name, the amount, the date, each letter formed with the same careful attention a bank teller might bring to a passbook entry. There is something reassuring about the money order itself once it's completed, a document that cannot simply be spent by whoever happens to open the envelope first. It requires your son's signature to be redeemed, a small safeguard that eases the particular anxiety of sending money across such distance, out of your sight and control for the several days it will take to arrive. You tuck the money order into the envelope alongside your letter, sealing it carefully, then sealing it again along the flap's edge with a small strip of tape, a habit you developed after hearing, second-hand, about a neighbour's letter arriving with its corner torn and its contents missing. Better to be careful, you've always believed, especially with something this important travelling this far from home. The letter itself took you the better part of an evening to write, sitting at the kitchen table after the dishes were cleared, the same table where the week's money is divided every Friday. You told him about his younger sister's recital, about the weather turning colder earlier than usual this year, about his father's hours at the plant increasing slightly, which explained, though you didn't say so directly, how you'd managed a little extra for him this month. You asked, as you always do, whether he was eating enough, whether his coat was warm enough for wherever this college happened to be located. Mr. Ostrowski hands you a small receipt once the transaction is complete, a slip of paper confirming the money order's details, which you fold carefully into your own pocketbook and file away at home in the same drawer that holds your household notebook. It feels important to keep this record, proof that the money was sent, should any question ever arise about whether it arrived. Walking home, you think about the journey this envelope is about to take, the trains it will ride, the hands it will pass through, each one entirely unknown to you, entirely trusted nonetheless. There is a particular kind of faith required in sending money this way, a faith in strangers, in postal workers you will never meet, in a system built entirely on the assumption that most people, given the choice, will simply do their job honestly. It will take the better part of a week for your son to receive it, longer than you'd like, though you've grown accustomed to the rhythm of it by now, this slower cadence of communication and support stretched across distance. You imagine him opening the envelope in whatever small dormitory room he's described in his letters, reading your words first, then finding the money order tucked carefully behind them, a small tangible reminder that home has not forgotten him, even from this far away. Some weeks you send a little extra when the household allows it. Other weeks you send exactly what's needed and no more, trusting him to understand, the way children eventually do, that his family's love is not measured by the amount, but by the consistency of it arriving, month after month, sealed twice for good measure, carried faithfully across whatever distance separates you. By the time you reach your own front door again, the errand complete, you feel the particular satisfaction that comes from having done something small but meaningful for someone you love, a satisfaction no faster or more modern system could quite replicate in exactly the same way. Many households kept a single notebook, often a simple composition book, where every dollar coming in and going out was written down by hand. It sat in a kitchen drawer, updated weekly, sometimes by the husband, sometimes by the wife, depending on the household. There is something almost sacred about seeing your whole financial life fit onto lined paper. Yours has a black marbled cover, the kind sold at the corner drugstore for a few cents, its pages ruled in faint blue lines that have guided your handwriting for going on 4 years now. You keep it in the same drawer as the labelled envelopes, close enough that both systems work together, the envelopes holding the physical money and the notebook holding the record of where every dollar has travelled once it left your hands. Tonight, as you do every Friday after the dishes are cleared and the children have settled into whatever quiet occupies their evening, you open it to the next blank page and begin the familiar ritual. The date goes first, written carefully in the top corner, followed by the week's income on the left side of the page, and the week's expenses arranged in a careful column on the right. Rent, groceries, coal, shoes, this week, since your youngest finally wore through the toe of her last pair. Church, Christmas club, savings, whatever small amount remains once everything else has been accounted for. The numbers themselves are unremarkable, small and modest the way most household numbers are, but there is something almost meditative in writing them down this way, watching a week's entire financial life reduce itself to a single tidy column, legible and honest. Nothing is estimated. Nothing is rounded generously in your own favour. If the grocery bill came to $4.31, that is precisely what gets written, down to the last cent, because the notebook only holds value if it holds the truth. You flip back occasionally, not tonight specifically, but often enough, to earlier pages, watching the small story of your family's finances unfold week by week, across months, and eventually years. There is the week your husband's hours were cut slightly, the numbers noticeably tighter for nearly 2 months afterward. There is the week your daughter was born, extra dollars carefully tracked for the doctor's visit, for the special things a new baby requires. There is the week you finally paid off the coat from layaway, its final payment recorded with what you remember, even now, as a small flourish of relief in your own handwriting. This notebook has become, without you ever intending it to, something like a diary written in numbers instead of words. It does not record your feelings directly, but anyone who understood how to read it carefully could trace the shape of difficult months and easier ones, simply by watching how the columns shifted, how certain envelopes ran thinner during illness or hardship, how others swelled slightly during good stretches when overtime was steady and nothing unexpected arose to demand an unplanned withdrawal. Your husband takes his turn with it some weeks, particularly when you're occupied with the children, or simply too tired after a long day to manage the careful arithmetic it demands. His handwriting looks different from yours in its pages, heavier, less careful, though no less honest, and there is something comforting in seeing both your handwritings mingled together across its months, evidence that this household's finances have always been a shared responsibility. However, it's divided week to week. You have taught your eldest daughter to help with it recently, showing her how to add the columns, how to check her arithmetic twice before trusting it, how to notice when something doesn't quite balance and trace back patiently until she finds where the error crept in. She takes to it seriously, tongue between her teeth in concentration, and you recognize, watching her, the exact same posture you must have worn at her age, learning this same skill at your own mother's kitchen table. By the time tonight's entry is finished, the page filled from top to bottom in careful legible figures, you close the notebook and return it to its drawer, satisfied in the particular way that only comes from seeing a task done thoroughly and honestly. There is no mystery left in your family's finances, no vague uncertainty about where the money has gone or whether it will stretch far enough to cover what remains of the month. It is all there in plain ink on lined paper, a small and unglamorous record of a life built carefully, one honest week at a time. Let's consider something bigger now, a car. For many families, this meant years of saving before a single dollar was spent. Car salesmen were used to cash buyers, and a family proudly driving home a second-hand sedan they had saved for outright felt an entirely different kind of ownership than one bought on credit. But you started again the following week, adding what you could, trusting that patience would eventually make up the difference. By the second year, the envelope had grown too thick for comfort, and Mr. Whitcomb suggested gently that it might be safer held in a proper savings account rather than a kitchen drawer. However careful you'd been with it, you agreed, and watching the full sum recorded in your passbook for the first time felt like crossing some invisible threshold, the abstract goal suddenly rendered concrete and official in a banker's careful handwriting. The final months of saving felt different from the earlier ones, charged with a kind of anticipation that made even routine Friday counting feel exciting. You began visiting the used car lot on Saturdays sometimes, not to buy, but simply to look, to imagine which sedan might eventually belong to your family, to ask the salesman polite questions about mileage and engine condition, careful never to reveal quite how close you actually were to being ready. When the day finally arrived, it arrived almost quietly, without the fanfare you might have expected after 3 years of careful preparation. You simply had, one Friday evening, exactly enough. Your husband counted the full savings twice at the kitchen table, the same table where every dollar of it had once been divided and set aside, and the two of you sat for a long moment afterward, simply looking at the total, hardly believing it had finally arrived. The following Saturday, you walked into the dealership together, your children trailing behind, unusually quiet, sensing that this errand carried more weight than the ordinary Saturday trips downtown. The salesman recognized you immediately from your previous visits, and something shifted in his manner the moment you mentioned you were ready to purchase outright in full that morning. There was a respect in his tone that hadn't quite been there before, the particular respect reserved for a cash buyer who has clearly earned every dollar being handed across the counter. You watched your husband count out the bills carefully, the same careful counting you'd both practiced for 3 years at your kitchen table, and the salesman recorded the transaction, handed over the keys, and shook your husband's hand with genuine warmth. There was no paperwork promising future payments, no interest to calculate, no lingering obligation trailing behind you as you walked toward the sedan parked proudly on the lot. Driving it home for the first time, your husband's hands steady on the wheel, your children pressed against the windows in the back seat, you felt something you hadn't quite anticipated feeling, a sense of ownership entirely different from anything you'd experienced before. This car belonged to you completely, free and clear, the moment it left the lot. No bank held any claim to it. No monthly payment loomed ahead, threatening to strain the household budget for years to come. That evening, parked in front of your house, the sedan gleaming faintly under the streetlight, you and your husband sat together on the porch steps simply looking at it, the way you might admire a garden you'd tended patiently for years before finally watching it bloom. 3 years of careful envelopes, of extra weekend labour, of small sacrifices woven quietly into an otherwise ordinary life, had produced this solid, tangible thing sitting in your driveway, owed to no one, earned entirely by patience. A home was often the one true debt a family carried, and even that came through a local bank face to face, with a manager who had watched the neighbourhood grow. Payments were made in person, sometimes walked over on a lunch break, the receipt tucked carefully into a drawer alongside every other one that came before it. You remember the day you signed the papers for this house, with a clarity that hasn't dimmed in the years since. Mr. Whitcomb sat across the desk from you and your husband, the same man who had watched over your Christmas club and your growing passbook for years by then, and there was something reassuring in facing this largest of all financial decisions with someone who already understood the shape of your family's careful habits. The mortgage itself felt enormous at the time, a number larger than anything you'd ever contemplated owing, and you remember the particular weight of your husband's signature beside yours, both of you fully aware of what you were committing to for the years ahead. But even this, the one significant debt your family would carry, came wrapped in the same personal trust that governed everything else. Mr. Whitcomb explained every term patiently, made certain you both understood exactly what was expected, and shook your hands warmly afterward, treating the moment with the seriousness it deserved. The payments themselves became woven into the rhythm of your month almost immediately. On the appointed day, you or your husband would walk the 6 blocks to the bank, envelope in hand, the mortgage payment counted out precisely from an envelope kept separate from all the others in your kitchen drawer. Some months your husband made the trip during his lunch break, hurrying back to the plant afterward with barely enough time to eat the sandwich you'd packed him that morning. Other months you made the walk yourself, passbook and payment both tucked into your handbag alongside whatever errands the day also required. Mr. Whitcomb recorded each payment personally, never delegating this particular transaction to a junior teller, as though he understood, without needing to be told, that a family's mortgage payment deserved the attention of someone who had watched that family's entire financial life unfold across years of careful envelopes and modest savings deposits. He would mark the payment in the bank's own ledger, then hand you a receipt, a small slip of paper that felt disproportionately important given its size. You kept every single one of these receipts tucked into a drawer in the hall table, organised by date, a paper trail stretching back to the very first payment made the month after you'd moved in. There was something satisfying in watching that stack grow thicker over the years, each receipt representing another month closer to the day the house would belong to you entirely, free of any bank's claim upon it. The neighbourhood itself seemed to understand the seriousness of home ownership in a way that felt communal rather than isolating. Neighbours compared notes occasionally, not competitively, but companionably, mentioning how many years remained on their own mortgages, offering quiet encouragement to families further behind in the process. The Hendersons had finished paying theirs off just last spring, and you remember the small gathering held in their backyard to celebrate homemade lemonade and a cake baked specially for the occasion, marking an achievement that took the better part of 2 decades to reach. Missing a payment was almost unthinkable, not simply because of whatever penalty might follow, but because it would have meant facing Mr. Whitcomb with an explanation, admitting that the careful system you'd maintained for years had somehow faltered. This social accountability mattered as much as any legal obligation. You budgeted around the mortgage payment the same way you budgeted around rent in your earlier years, treating it as an obligation that could not bend, positioned at the very front of your Friday envelope dividing ritual, before groceries, before coal, before anything else the week might demand. There were harder months, certainly, stretches when your husband's hours were reduced, and the mortgage payment strained against what little else remained. During those times, you remember visiting Mr. Whitcomb directly, explaining the situation honestly, and finding him willing to work with your family in ways that felt entirely human rather than institutional. He never once treated your temporary hardship as a mark against your character, understanding, as he seemed to understand everything about the neighbourhood's rhythms, that a good family occasionally faced difficult stretches through no fault of their own. As the years passed, the mortgage payments became so routine they barely registered as remarkable anymore, simply another fixed point in the household's monthly rhythm, as certain as Sunday church or Friday's pay envelope. You watch the remaining balance shrink slowly in your passbook, year after year, the house becoming incrementally more yours with each payment recorded in Mr. Whitcomb's careful hand. Now, with the balance finally approaching its end, you find yourself thinking back to that first nervous signing, wondering if your younger self could have imagined this exact moment, sitting at your own kitchen table with a stack of receipts thick enough to fill a shoebox, evidence of years of careful, honest payment, made not to a distant institution, but to a man who watched your family's fortunes rise and fall with the same attention he gave his own, and who never once let you forget that home ownership, however slowly earned, was something worth being proud of. It is worth remembering that medicine was not always paid for strictly in cash. In smaller towns especially, a doctor might be paid partly in dollars and partly in eggs, firewood, or a homemade pie left on the porch. Money moved in more than one form back then, and there was no shame attached to it. Dr. Hartley's office sits above the hardware store downtown, a modest set of rooms reached by a narrow staircase that creaks in exactly the same places it has creaked for as long as anyone can remember. He has tended this neighbourhood for nearly 30 years now, delivering half its children, setting the broken bones of its more adventurous boys, sitting quietly at bedsides during illnesses both minor and grave. He knows, better than almost anyone in town, which families can pay easily and which cannot, and he has never once let that knowledge change the quality of care he offers. You remember the winter your youngest came down with a fever that frightened you more than you let onto your husband. The kind of fever that kept you awake through several long nights, cool cloths pressed to her forehead, watching her chest rise and fall with an attention that bordered on desperate. Dr. Hartley came to the house twice that week, staying longer than his fee could possibly have justified, checking her over with the same careful thoroughness he might show a wealthier family across town. When the illness finally broke and she was well enough to sit up and ask for broth, you worried, quietly, about how you would settle his bill given how thin the household budget had grown during a particularly difficult stretch that winter. You need not have worried so much. When you finally raised the subject, Dr. Hartley waved it off gently, mentioning instead that his wife had been asking after good preserves, and that he had heard, through the general grapevine of the neighbourhood, that yours were particularly fine. You spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon selecting from your pantry shelves jars of peach preserves and pickled beans put up the previous summer, arranging them carefully in a basket alongside a fresh loaf of bread, and delivered them personally to his office the following week. He accepted them with genuine pleasure, not the polite pretense of a man settling for less than he deserved, but real appreciation, the kind that comes from a man who has spent his whole career embedded in a community where such exchanges are simply how things work. This was not an isolated arrangement. Your neighbour 2 doors down, whose husband works as a carpenter, settled an entire winter's worth of medical visits by repairing Dr. Hartley's porch steps, which had been sagging dangerously for months before anyone got around to fixing them properly. The Petrocellis, further down the block, paid partly in fresh eggs from their small backyard coop, delivered weekly through the coldest months when Mrs. Petrocelli's arthritis required regular attention. There is a particular dignity in this system that a strictly cash arrangement sometimes lacks. Nobody in these exchanges feels like a charity case, accepting help they cannot properly repay. Instead, everyone brings something of value to the arrangement, whether it's dollars earned at the plant, vegetables grown carefully in a backyard garden, or skilled labour offered in exchange for skilled medical care. It levels something that might otherwise feel uneven, transforming a simple financial transaction into something closer to genuine neighbourly exchange. Dr. Hartley himself seems to understand this instinctively, never pushing families towards strict cash payment, when he can sense that an alternative arrangement might ease their burden without diminishing his own fair compensation. He keeps a small ledger, much like Mr. Kowalski's grocery notebook, tracking not just dollars owed but favours extended and repaid, firewood delivered last winter, a fence mended in exchange for a course of medicine, each entry as valid and respected as any cash transaction might be. You think sometimes about what this arrangement asks of a community. The trust required to believe that a jar of preserves genuinely equals a portion of a medical bill, that a repaired porch step fairly settles weeks of careful attention during an illness. It requires everyone involved to value each other's contributions honestly, without the precise, impersonal calculation a stranger might insist upon. As your children grow older, you find yourself hoping they carry forward some version of this understanding, this recognition that value exists in many forms beyond the dollars counted out in envelopes each Friday. There is something quietly beautiful in a system built this way, one that bends to accommodate whatever each family has to offer, rather than insisting rigidly that only cash will do. And you suspect that long after credit cards and modern banking eventually change how these transactions happen, the basic human instinct behind this kind of exchange, generous, practical, and rooted entirely in trust, will find some way to persist. Let's step into the local diner for a moment, where a cup of coffee cost a nickel and a full breakfast rarely broke $1. Prices were small, but so were paychecks, and every purchase was weighed carefully against what else that same dollar could have bought instead. The diner sits on the corner across from the bank, its neon sign humming softly even in daylight, the same sign that has marked this particular corner for as long as you can remember. Inside, the counter stretches the length of the room, stools worn smooth from decades of regulars settling onto them each morning, and the smell of frying bacon mingles with strong coffee and the particular sweetness of maple syrup warming on the griddle nearby. You don't visit often, not because the prices are unreasonable, but because every dollar spent here is a dollar that isn't going toward rent or coal, or the growing car envelope tucked away in your kitchen drawer. Still, on occasion, a Saturday morning treat feels worth the small indulgence, and today you've brought your daughter along, a rare mother-daughter outing that costs in total less than a single hour of your husband's wages at the plant. Gladys behind the counter greets you both by name, sliding 2 menus across the counter more out of habit than necessity, since you both already know exactly what you'll order. A nickel gets you black coffee, refilled as many times as you like without a second charge. A generosity that always strikes you as slightly remarkable, given how little that nickel actually covers. Your daughter orders a glass of milk, 3 cents, and a single pancake with syrup, another dime, and you calculate quickly in your head, the way you calculate everything these days, arriving at a total that still leaves room in your small allotted treat money for the walk home. While you wait, you watch the diner's other patrons with quiet interest, the particular economy of small choices playing out around you. A workman at the far end orders only coffee, no food, clearly stretching his own budget carefully until payday arrives. 2 women near the window share a single plate of eggs and toast between them, splitting the modest cost evenly, chatting easily despite the practical necessity behind their shared meal. Gladys sets your coffee down, black and steaming, and you wrap both hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into your fingers, still slightly chilled from the walkover. Your daughter's pancake arrives moments later, and she eats it with the particular seriousness of a child who understands, even at her young age, that this small treat represents a genuine, considered expense rather than something casually purchased without thought. You think, sipping your coffee slowly to make it last, about how differently this same dollar might have been spent. $1 could cover most of a week's coal in the coldest months. It could nearly settle a week's worth of shoes for a growing child. It could add meaningfully to the Christmas Club booklet, bringing December's total that much closer to whatever modest celebration you're planning. Every purchase, even one this small, carries the shadow of these alternatives, a quiet calculation running constantly beneath the surface of daily life. This is not deprivation, exactly, though it might look that way to someone unfamiliar with how carefully a household like yours must weigh every expenditure. It is simply awareness, a clear-eyed understanding of what $1 represents and what it might otherwise accomplish. An understanding that makes moments like this one, a Saturday morning treat shared with your daughter, feel genuinely special rather than casually forgettable. Gladys refills your coffee without being asked, topping it off with the easy generosity of someone who understands that a nickel's worth of coffee, stretched across several refills, represents good value for a customer who will return week after week, year after year, as loyal in her own small way as you are to Mr. Kowalski's grocery or Mr. Whitcomb's bank. Your daughter finishes her pancake, licking the last traces of syrup from her fork with unself-conscious pleasure, and you find yourself smiling at her simple satisfaction, remembering your own childhood trips to this same diner with your own mother, the same counter, perhaps even some of the same stools, worn just slightly smoother in the years since. Walking home afterward, your daughter's hand in yours, you think about how these small, carefully considered pleasures carry more weight, somehow, than they might in a household where money flowed more freely. A nickel cup of coffee becomes not just a beverage but a small ritual, a considered choice made deliberately rather than absent-mindedly, and there is something quietly satisfying in that, a reminder that value isn't only measured in what something costs, but in how carefully it was chosen, and how genuinely it was enjoyed once finally received. Many parents gave their children a small weekly allowance, not to spend freely, but to practice the very habits the household lived by. A dime for the piggy bank, a nickel for the collection plate, a penny for candy if there was any left over. It was one of the earliest lessons a child learned, long before school ever touched the subject. Every Saturday morning, before the day's other errands begin, you sit at the kitchen table with your 2 eldest children, the same table where the family's own finances are divided every Friday evening, and hand each of them their weekly 16 cents, counted out carefully from a small tin kept specifically for this purpose. It is not a large sum by any measure, but it is enough to teach the lessons that matter most, and you have come to believe over the years that the amount itself matters far less than the habit being formed around it. Your eldest, now 9, has developed her own careful system, remarkably similar to the household's envelope method, though she would likely be surprised to realize how closely she's mimicked it. She keeps 3 small containers on her dresser, each labelled in her own careful, still developing handwriting. One holds her savings, a dime set aside faithfully each week toward a doll she's been wanting from the department store window. Another holds a nickel destined for Sunday's collection plate, a habit she's absorbed simply from watching you prepare your own envelope each week, without ever being formally instructed to do the same. The third smallest container holds whatever penny remains, her only truly discretionary spending, usually destined for a piece of candy from Mr. Kowalski's shop. You remember the conversation that first prompted this system nearly a year ago now, when she asked, with the particular directness only children seem to manage, why grown-ups always seem to be counting money into different piles. You explained it as simply as you could: the envelopes in the kitchen drawer, the Christmas Club booklet, the notebook tracking every dollar's journey through the household. She listened with unusual seriousness for a child her age, and within a week she had devised her own smaller version, proud enough of it that she insisted on showing you each container individually, explaining its purpose as though you hadn't been the one to inspire the whole idea in the first place. Your younger son, only 6, manages a simpler version, not yet capable of the more sophisticated three-way division his sister has mastered. He simply saves what he can in a small ceramic pig kept on his windowsill, dropping coins in through the slot on top with visible satisfaction each time, listening to the small clink they make joining whatever coins already rest inside. He's not yet learned patience the way his sister has, occasionally begging to break open the pig prematurely when some new toy catches his attention in a shop window, and you've learned to gently redirect these moments, explaining that some things are worth waiting for, that the pig will feel considerably heavier and more satisfying to finally open once it's genuinely full. There is a particular pleasure in watching these lessons take root, without much formal instruction, beyond the initial explanation and the steady, weekly example you and your husband provide. Children absorb far more from watching than from being told, and you suspect that the sight of you and your husband counting Friday's pay envelope, dividing careful piles across the kitchen table, has taught your children more about money than any lecture ever could. Occasionally, one of them will ask to accompany you on your Saturday morning trip to the bank, curious about the passbook and the careful conversation with Mr. Whitcomb, and you always allow it, understanding that these small excursions plant seeds that will matter far more than they realise at their young age. Your daughter has begun asking, recently, whether she might open her own small account someday, once her savings container holds enough to make the trip worthwhile, and you feel a particular pride at this request, evidence that the habits you've modelled so carefully are beginning to take hold in her own developing understanding of the world. These lessons extend beyond simple saving too. When your son wanted a particular toy last month and discovered his ceramic pig didn't yet hold enough to cover it, you didn't simply supplement the difference yourself, however tempting that might have been to avoid his disappointment. Instead, you suggested small chores he might complete around the house, sweeping the porch, helping carry groceries from Mr. Kowalski's shop, each one earning him an additional penny or two toward his goal. He learned, through this small experience, that money connects directly to effort, a lesson that will serve him considerably better than simply having his wants met without any corresponding work. Watching them grow into these habits, you think often about your own mother, who taught you these exact lessons at this exact table, using nearly identical methods, adjusted only slightly for whatever coins were common currency during her own childhood decades earlier. It feels like tending a small patient garden, planting seeds you may not see fully bloom for years, trusting that the careful, consistent example set today will eventually produce children who understand, deeply and instinctively, that money deserves respect, patience, and careful consideration. Exactly the same understanding that has carried your own household steadily through whatever challenges each year has brought. Let's talk about a visitor many households expected without fail, the insurance man, walking door to door each week to collect a small premium in person, writing the payment into a little booklet kept on the mantel. It was slow, personal, and entirely different from paperwork mailed and forgotten. Every Thursday afternoon, right around 4 o'clock, you hear the same familiar knock at your front door, 3 quick raps followed by a brief pause a pattern you've come to recognize instantly, even from the kitchen. Mr. Sullivan has represented the same insurance company in this neighborhood for as long as you've lived here, walking the same several blocks week after week, rain or shine, carrying his worn leather satchel filled with premium booklets for every family on his route. You open the door and he greets you with the same pleasant, unhurried manner he's shown every single week for the past 6 years, removing his hat briefly as a small courtesy before stepping just inside the doorway, never presuming to enter further than necessary for this brief transaction. He asks after your husband, after the children, genuine interest evident in his questions rather than mere pleasantry, because Mr. Sullivan has watched your family grow and change across the years of his weekly visits, present for small milestones simply by virtue of his consistent presence. The premium booklet itself sits on your mantel between visits, a small blue pamphlet with your family's policy details printed on its cover, and a series of lines inside where each week's payment gets carefully recorded. You retrieve it now, along with the modest sum owed this week, 25 cents toward the life insurance policy your husband took out shortly after your wedding. A small but steady investment in your family's future security. Mr. Sullivan counts the coins carefully, though he barely needs to, trusting your family's consistency after so many years of reliable payment. He records the transaction in the booklet with a practiced hand, his own steady penmanship joining the long column of previous entries stretching back to your policy's very beginning. Then he tears off a small receipt from his own separate ledger book, a duplicate record kept for the company's files, and hands it to you with the same small ceremony he brings to every visit. There is something valuable in this weekly ritual beyond simply the insurance payment itself. Mr. Sullivan has become, over the years, something like an informal check on the neighborhood's well-being, walking his route regularly enough that he would likely notice quickly if something seemed genuinely wrong at any particular house. A family struggling more than usual, an illness lingering longer than expected. He mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd noticed the Hendersons seemed to be managing more tightly than usual last winter, and you remember feeling a quiet reassurance that someone besides the immediate neighbours was paying this kind of steady, unremarkable attention to how everyone on the block was truly faring. The insurance itself feels almost abstract most weeks. A small sum paid faithfully toward a benefit you hope never to actually need. But you remember vividly when the Petrocellis lost their eldest son to a sudden illness 2 years back, how the policy Mr. Sullivan had faithfully collected premiums for across a decade suddenly became devastatingly real and necessary, providing funds that helped the family manage funeral costs and the difficult months that followed without additional financial strain compounding their grief. This memory sits quietly in the back of your mind each Thursday as you retrieve your own family's premium, a reminder that this small weekly ritual, unremarkable as it feels in the moment, represents a genuine hedge against whatever unexpected hardship the future might eventually bring. You think of it similarly to the cigar box in your closet, though this particular form of protection extends beyond what any hidden reserve of cash could realistically cover. Mr. Sullivan moves on after your transaction is complete, continuing his route toward the Andersons' house 2 doors down, his leather satchel a little lighter now that your payment joins the collections he's gathered throughout the afternoon. You watch him walk away for a moment before closing your door, thinking about how many households across this neighborhood alone depend on this same steady, personal system, dozens of families trusting a single reliable man to walk their premiums faithfully back to whatever office processes them each week. Your children have grown accustomed to Mr. Sullivan's visits too, sometimes greeting him at the door themselves when they happen to be nearby, and you suspect that someday, when they manage their own households, they'll remember this weekly rhythm, this particular blend of financial responsibility and genuine neighbourly connection that feels, increasingly like something worth preserving, even as the wider world seems to be moving steadily toward more distant, impersonal ways of handling exactly this kind of important, protective arrangement. A family vacation was not casually decided. It was saved for, sometimes over an entire year, coins dropped into a labelled jar on top of the icebox. By the time August arrived, that jar held exactly enough for gas, a motel, and a little spending money, no more and no less. The jar has sat atop your icebox since last September, a simple glass container that once held pickles before being thoroughly washed and repurposed for this specific, hopeful purpose. A strip of masking tape wraps around its middle, the word vacation written across it in your husband's blocky handwriting, visible from across the kitchen as a constant quiet reminder of what this year's careful saving is building toward. It began with a conversation last autumn, your husband mentioning, almost wistfully, that he'd love for the children to see the ocean someday, having grown up himself in a landlocked town and never once glimpsed it until his own brief military service took him briefly to a coast he barely had time to appreciate before shipping out again. You remember the look on his face describing it, and you suggested gently that perhaps this was something the family could work toward together, one careful jar at a time. Since then, that jar has become something of a family project, every member contributing according to their own small means. Your husband drops in whatever loose change remains in his pocket most evenings, a habit that's become as automatic as hanging his hat on its hook by the door. You add whatever surplus remains after the week's careful envelope division, sometimes only a few coins, other weeks a full dollar when circumstances allow for it. Even your children contribute occasionally, a penny here or there from their own small allowances, proud to be part of something the whole family is working toward together. There is a particular pleasure in watching that jar's level rise slowly across the months, visible progress marked not in careful ledger entries, but in the simple, satisfying accumulation of coins and folded bills pressing gradually higher against the glass. Your daughter likes to lift it occasionally, testing its weight, announcing with great seriousness whether she believes it feels heavier than it did the previous week, an assessment that's rarely accurate but always earnestly delivered. Through the winter months, contributions came slowly, competing as they did with Cole's more urgent demands and the occasional unexpected doctor's visit that required redirecting funds elsewhere. But even during the leanest weeks, someone in the family managed to add something, even if only a single penny, because abandoning the effort entirely felt somehow like giving up on something that mattered more than its modest dollar value might suggest. Spring brought renewed enthusiasm, the promise of summer feeling suddenly closer and more real as the weather warmed and the days lengthened. Your husband began mentioning specific details now, a particular stretch of coastline he'd read about, roughly how many hours the drive might take, what kind of modest motel might accommodate a family of 4 without straining whatever the jar eventually produced. These conversations happened most often in the evening after dinner, the jar sitting visible on the icebox as though participating quietly in its own planning session. By early summer, you began calculating more seriously, counting the jar's contents every few weeks now, instead of simply eyeballing its rising level. Gas would require a certain amount, calculated carefully based on the distance your husband estimated from his careful study of the road atlas borrowed from the library. The motel, modest as it would need to be, required its own separate allowance, and beyond these necessities you hoped for just enough extra to allow a few small treats along the way, an ice cream cone at some roadside stand, perhaps a modest souvenir each child could choose for themselves. The final weeks before your planned August departure brought a flurry of last-minute contributions, everyone in the household suddenly eager to see the jar reach its necessary total. Your husband picked up an extra half-day shift specifically for this purpose. You sold a few jars of preserves to a neighbour who'd admired them at a church gathering. Even your son contributed his entire ceramic pig savings, insisting with surprising maturity for his age that seeing the ocean mattered more to him than whatever toy he'd originally been saving toward. When the jar finally emptied onto your kitchen table for its final counting, the coins and bills spread out in careful piles, the way Friday's pay envelope always is, you felt a genuine swell of pride watching the total finally match almost exactly what your husband had calculated the trip would require. There was no debt trailing behind this vacation, no anxious calculation of how you'd manage payments for months afterward. Every dollar spent on that trip had been earned specifically for this purpose, patiently, across nearly a full year of careful collective effort. Driving toward the coast weeks later, your children pressed excitedly against the car windows. You found yourself thinking about that empty glass jar now sitting temporarily unused atop your icebox back home, already anticipating the moment you'd return and begin filling it again, patiently, one careful coin at a time, toward whatever destination next year's collective saving might eventually make possible. Let's be honest about the harder weeks too. When money ran short, families made do, meals stretched further, a trip was postponed. A neighbour might quietly loan a few dollars, expecting nothing but the same kindness returned someday. There was no card to lean on, only patience and community. You remember one particular stretch 2 winters ago with a clarity that hasn't faded, the kind of memory that settles into a household's shared history and gets referenced occasionally afterward, a shorthand for hardship weathered and survived. Your husband's hours had been cut at the plant that January, not eliminated entirely, but reduced enough that the pay envelope arriving each Friday held noticeably less than the household had grown accustomed to managing around. The first adjustment came quietly, almost instinctively, before you'd even sat down to recalculate the week's envelopes formally. Dinner portions grew slightly smaller, though you were careful never to let the children notice any deliberate reduction, simply serving the roast a little thinner, stretching the potatoes with a bit more onion and broth than usual, making a single chicken last 3 separate meals instead of 2 through careful use of every part of it. The carcass eventually simmered into a broth that anchored an entire pot of soup toward the end of the week. The shoes envelope, already thin, stopped receiving contributions entirely for nearly 2 months, and you found yourself grateful, in a way you hadn't fully appreciated before, that your children's shoes had all been in reasonably good repair when the difficulty began. Church continued, unwavering, because whatever else bent during hard stretches, that particular commitment felt too important to compromise, even if the amount offered each Sunday shrank slightly smaller than usual. The vacation jar, which had been building steadily toward a modest summer trip, absorbed the heaviest blow. You and your husband discussed it quietly one evening after the children were asleep and agreed, without much difficulty, that the trip would simply wait another year. There was disappointment in this decision, certainly, but no real crisis, because you had never spent money you didn't actually have, and postponing a dream funded by discretionary saving felt entirely different from failing to meet an actual obligation. It was during the hardest week of that stretch, when the grocery envelope had run dry 3 days before payday and the cigar box in the closet held less than you'd hoped, that Mrs. Delacroix appeared at your door one afternoon, ostensibly just to visit, carrying a basket of vegetables from her own garden's late harvest that she claimed, with obvious generosity thinly disguised as simple abundance, she couldn't possibly use before they spoiled. You understood immediately what this visit actually represented, and you accepted the basket with genuine gratitude, understanding that refusing it would have insulted the careful kindness behind the gesture. A few days later, when the situation grew slightly more pressing, you found yourself, with considerable reluctance, walking next door to ask whether the Hendersons might lend a few dollars until Friday's payday finally arrived. This was not a request you made lightly. Asking for help, even from close neighbours, required swallowing a particular kind of pride that had been carefully built over years of managing your own household's finances without ever needing outside assistance. Mrs. Henderson answered the door and listened to your careful, slightly embarrassed explanation with immediate, uncomplicated warmth, disappearing briefly into her kitchen and returning with exactly the amount you'd requested, refusing even to discuss when or how you might repay it. "Pay it forward sometime," she said simply, "when someone else needs it more than we do right now." There was no interest attached to this loan, no formal agreement, nothing beyond the quiet, unspoken understanding that this was simply how the neighbourhood functioned during difficult stretches, everyone taking turns being the one who needed help and the one able to offer it. You repaid the Hendersons the following Friday, the moment your husband's pay envelope arrived, walking next door before you'd even divided the week's money into its usual careful piles, because settling this particular debt felt more urgent than anything else the week required. Mrs. Henderson accepted the returned money with the same easy grace she'd shown lending it, and neither of you mentioned the matter again beyond that single simple exchange. Looking back now, with your husband's hours long since restored to their usual schedule, and the vacation jar once again filling steadily atop the icebox, you think about how differently that difficult stretch might have felt in a world where borrowing meant signing papers with a distant bank rather than knocking on a neighbour's door. There was something almost dignified in the way your community handled hardship. No formal application required. No interest calculated against your temporary misfortune. Simply people who knew each other well enough to trust that today's help would eventually be repaid in kind whenever circumstances reversed themselves. Your children remember that winter too, though their memories are gentler than yours, coloured mostly by vague recollections of simpler dinners and a postponed vacation they accepted with the easy resilience children often manage better than adults expect. They don't remember worry, because you were careful never to let that worry become visible to them, understanding that a child's sense of security matters more than any temporary financial strain the household might be quietly managing. What you remember most clearly, though, is not the hardship itself, but the community that surrounded and supported your family through it. Mrs. Delacroix's vegetables, the Hendersons' quiet loan, the general sense that no family in this neighbourhood ever truly faced difficulty entirely alone. It is a kind of security that no bank account or insurance policy could quite replicate. This knowledge that your neighbours would notice if you struggled and would help quietly and without judgment, exactly as you would do for them if their own circumstances ever required it. You move through the remaining envelopes together. Coal, shoes, church, the vacation jar's contribution, explaining the reasoning behind each amount, the small adjustments made based on the season or recent circumstances. When you reach the notebook itself, you hand her the pencil directly, guiding her through recording each figure in its appropriate column, watching her form the numbers carefully, tongue between her teeth in exactly the same concentrated expression. You remember wearing yourself at this exact table decades ago, learning this exact skill from your own mother. This is not the first time she's helped with these tasks, certainly. She's assisted with smaller pieces of the household's financial management for years now, counting coins into the Christmas Club booklet, occasionally accompanying you to settle accounts with Mr. Kowalski or make deposits with Mr. Whitcomb. But tonight feels different, more deliberate, an acknowledgement that she is approaching an age where these lessons need to solidify into genuine understanding rather than simply comfortable familiarity. You explain the reasoning behind the cigar box too, walking her through the logic of keeping a small reserve separate from the bank, showing her for the first time exactly where it's hidden, and roughly how much it currently holds. This feels like an important threshold to cross, extending to her a piece of information previously reserved for adult household management, a quiet acknowledgement that she is beginning to be trusted with the fuller picture of how this family actually functions financially. She asks thoughtful questions throughout the evening, wondering aloud what happens during particularly difficult weeks, how decisions get made about which envelope to prioritize when circumstances tighten unexpectedly. You share, gently, some of the harder stretches your family has weathered over the years, the winter your husband's hours were cut, the careful borrowing from the Hendersons eventually repaid the following Friday. Being honest about hardship without frightening her about the family's actual current stability. You also explain carefully the newer charge account your family maintains at the department store, walking her through the discipline required to use such convenience responsibly, the firm rule you and your husband established never to charge beyond what you could already afford outright. This feels like an important lesson too, perhaps more important than the older systems, given how the world seems to be shifting increasingly toward exactly this kind of convenient delayed payment arrangement. By the end of the evening, the week's envelopes are properly divided, the notebook's entry complete in her own careful handwriting alongside years of your own entries filling its earlier pages, and you feel a particular satisfaction watching her absorb these lessons so thoroughly, understanding that you're passing along something considerably more valuable than the specific dollar amounts recorded tonight. You think about your own mother teaching you these exact lessons at roughly the same age, at what was likely this exact table, if the house's history stretches back far enough to include such continuity. There is something quietly moving in recognizing yourself now on the other side of that lesson, no longer the daughter learning but the mother teaching, passing forward a discipline that has carried your own household steadily through both comfortable years and difficult ones. Your daughter closes the notebook carefully when you're finished, returning it to its familiar drawer alongside the labelled envelopes, and you notice her handling these items with a new kind of respect, understanding perhaps more fully than before exactly how much careful thought and steady discipline underlies what has always seemed, from her earlier more casual observation, like simple household routine. Someday, you think, watching her, she will sit at her own kitchen table, teaching her own daughter these same careful lessons. The specific dollar amounts different by then, certainly, shaped by whatever economic realities her own adult life eventually brings. But the underlying discipline, the patience, the careful honesty, passed forward intact, exactly as your own mother passed it to you. For many families, financial stability rested on one steady factory or union job, often held by the same man for decades. That single paycheck, arriving reliably every week, allowed for the kind of careful, predictable budgeting that made envelopes and notebooks possible in the first place. Your husband has worked the same line at the plant for 11 years now, ever since he came home from his brief military service and walked through those gates on a recommendation from his uncle, who had worked there himself for nearly 2 decades before retiring. There is something steadying in this kind of permanence, a job that does not change from year to year, a paycheck whose general shape you can predict with reasonable confidence months or even years in advance, barring the occasional slow stretch when hours get trimmed temporarily. The union itself plays a quiet but significant role in this stability, negotiating each year for wages that keep pace, more or less, with the slowly rising cost of living, ensuring that the envelope your husband carries home each Friday retains roughly the same purchasing power it held the year before. You remember the strike 3 years back, tense weeks when the picket line outside the plant gates meant no paycheck arrived at all, and how the cigar box and savings account both had to absorb that unexpected strain until the dispute finally resolved in the workers' favour. That strike taught you something important about the fragility hiding beneath even the most reliable seeming arrangements, a lesson you've carried forward in how carefully you've maintained your reserves ever since. But it also taught you something about solidarity, about how the entire neighbourhood, dozens of families all connected through that same plant, weathered those difficult weeks together, sharing what surplus anyone had, trading favours and vegetables and quiet loans exactly the way you did during your own family's harder winter. Your husband takes genuine pride in his work, in the particular skill he's developed over years operating machinery that would baffle an untrained hand, and this pride translates into something valuable for your household's financial planning. He knows, with reasonable certainty, that his position is secure as long as he continues showing up reliably, working carefully, avoiding the kind of trouble that might jeopardize his standing with the foreman. This security, unglamorous as it might sound, described plainly, forms the entire foundation upon which every other careful system in your household rests. Without that steady paycheck, none of it would function quite the same way. The envelopes would hold less certainty if you couldn't predict, week to week, roughly what would arrive to fill them. The Christmas Club would feel more like a gamble than a patient certainty if you weren't confident the 50 cents could be spared reliably every single week for an entire year. Even the mortgage, that one significant debt your family carries, only feels manageable because you can count on Mr. Whitcomb's ledger being fed by the same steady source, month after month, year after year. You think sometimes about the other men your husband works alongside. Dozens of families across the neighbourhood, all depending on that same plant's continued operation, all building their own versions of your careful systems atop the same foundation of steady, reliable employment. The Hendersons, the Petrocellis, old Mr. Feeney before his retirement, all of them structured their household's finances around this same basic assumption, that the plant would remain open, that the union would keep negotiating fairly, that Friday would keep arriving with dependable regularity. There is a particular kind of gratitude you feel toward this arrangement that's difficult to fully articulate, a gratitude aimed not at any single person but at the whole interlocking system, the union representatives who negotiate carefully each contract cycle, the foreman who has always treated your husband fairly, even the machinery itself, reliable enough that injuries remain rare and the work, while demanding, doesn't grind a man down before his time the way some factory jobs are known to do elsewhere. Your husband mentions occasionally, usually late in the evening after the children are settled, dreams of what retirement might eventually look like. Decades from now, the pension the union has negotiated providing some continued income even after his working years finally conclude. This too factors into your careful planning, a distant but real consideration shaping how much you save now versus how much you spend. Understanding that today's discipline builds toward a security that will matter even more once his working days are finally behind him. You watch your son sometimes, only 6 but already fascinated by his father's stories about the plant, the machinery, the particular camaraderie among the men who've worked that same line together for years. You wonder if he'll follow this same path eventually, walking through those same gates on someone's recommendation, building his own household stability atop the same foundation of steady, reliable, union-protected work that has carried your own family so faithfully through 11 years of careful budgeting, patient saving, and the quiet, unglamorous security of knowing every single Friday exactly what will be waiting in that familiar paper envelope. Let's imagine an unexpected expense. The refrigerator failing on a Tuesday morning. Without a credit card to soften the blow, the cigar box in the closet or the small savings account downtown became the only cushion. It meant a tighter month ahead, but it also meant nothing was owed to anyone by the time it was paid for. You remember the exact sound it made, a low groaning followed by an abrupt final silence, the particular quiet of a machine that has simply stopped trying. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every other respect. The children already off to school, your husband already gone to the plant, and you standing alone in the kitchen listening to that sudden absence of sound where a familiar hum should have been. The milk had gone slightly warm by the time you noticed, and a small knot of worry settled into your stomach as you opened the door and confirmed what you already suspected. The refrigerator, faithful for nearly 6 years since you'd purchased it second-hand from a family moving out of state, had finally given up entirely, and there was no ignoring the problem or postponing its resolution the way you might delay a smaller inconvenience. You called the repairman that same morning, a kind but direct man named Mr. Doyle, who arrived within the hour and delivered his verdict with the particular bluntness of someone who has diagnosed hundreds of failing appliances and learned that customers generally prefer honesty to false hope. The compressor had failed, he explained, the kind of failure that would cost nearly as much to repair as simply purchasing a modest replacement unit outright. You sat with this news for a moment, doing the mental arithmetic you've grown so accustomed to over years of careful household management, running through your available resources with the same methodical clarity you bring to Friday's envelope division. The regular grocery and household envelopes couldn't absorb this kind of expense without leaving the family genuinely short elsewhere. This left 2 possibilities: the cigar box in the closet, or the small savings account you'd been building steadily at Mr. Whitcomb's bank. You decided, after brief consideration, to draw from both, taking the modest sum from the cigar box first and supplementing it with a withdrawal from your savings account later that same afternoon. There was no anxiety in this decision beyond the simple disappointment of watching months of careful saving disappear into an unglamorous appliance rather than toward whatever more pleasant purpose you'd originally been accumulating it for. Walking to the bank that afternoon felt different from your usual Saturday morning visits, this errand carrying a slightly heavier weight despite being, in the broader scheme of things, a genuinely minor financial setback. Mr. Whitcomb processed the withdrawal with his usual careful attention, asking gently what had prompted it, and nodding with quiet sympathy when you explained about the refrigerator. "These things happen," he said simply, the understatement of a man who has watched countless families weather exactly this kind of ordinary hardship over his years managing this branch. The new refrigerator arrived 2 days later, a modest but reliable model that Mr. Doyle himself recommended, delivered and installed by 2 young men who manoeuvred it carefully through your kitchen doorway with the practiced efficiency of people who've performed this exact task dozens of times before. You paid them in full at the moment of delivery, counting out the bills carefully from the combined resources of your cigar box and savings withdrawal, and watched them cart away the old, broken unit without a single dollar of debt trailing behind this entire transaction. The following weeks required careful adjustment elsewhere in the household budget, a tighter grip on the grocery envelope, a temporary pause in contributions to the vacation jar, small sacrifices made deliberately to begin rebuilding what the refrigerator had suddenly demanded. You explained this briefly to your children, not in a way meant to worry them, but simply as honest acknowledgement that some months require more careful attention than others, a lesson you hope they'll carry forward into their own eventual households. Your husband, hearing the full story that evening after returning from the plant, nodded with the same calm acceptance Mr. Whitcomb had shown, understanding that this was simply the nature of maintaining a household, that appliances eventually fail, roofs eventually need repair, unexpected expenses eventually arrive regardless of how carefully you've planned everything else. What mattered, he said, running his hand along the new refrigerator's smooth white surface, was that you'd handled it without owing anyone anything beyond the store's own fair asking price. This felt true to you as well, sitting together that evening at the kitchen table, reviewing the week's finances with this unexpected expense now fully absorbed and accounted for in the notebook's careful columns. There was no lingering payment plan stretching months into the future, no interest accumulating against your temporary hardship, simply the straightforward fact of a problem encountered and resolved entirely through resources you'd patiently built for exactly this kind of unpredictable circumstance. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind you as you worked, its steady, reliable sound already becoming as familiar and comforting as the one it had replaced. Church was not only a spiritual commitment, but a financial one too. A small envelope prepared each week for the collection plate, budgeted for just as carefully as the electric bill. It was simply another line item in a life built around careful, intentional giving. The envelope sits ready every Saturday evening, prepared alongside the rest of the week's careful division. A small amount set aside without exception, regardless of how tight other categories might be running that particular week. You learned this discipline from your own mother, who taught you that this particular commitment, unlike nearly everything else in a household budget, should never bend to circumstance, that giving faithfully mattered precisely because it required sacrifice, rather than simply offering whatever happened to remain after every other need was satisfied. Sunday morning arrives with its own particular rhythm, different from the rest of the week, unhurried in a way that feels earned after 6 days of careful counting and dividing. You dress the children carefully, your daughter in her good dress, your son in the small suit that already seems slightly too short in the sleeves, evidence of how quickly he's grown since Easter. The walk to church takes you past several other families making the same familiar journey, neighbours greeting each other with the particular warmth reserved for Sunday mornings, unhurried conversation exchanged along sidewalks that will be busier and more purposeful come Monday. Inside the sanctuary, sunlight filters through stained glass windows, casting soft-coloured patches across the wooden pews that have held this congregation for generations. The organ begins its familiar prelude, and you settle into your usual seat, the envelope already tucked into your handbag, ready for the moment the collection plate begins its careful journey down each row. When the plate finally reaches you, passed hand to hand along the pew, you place your envelope inside without ceremony. The same modest amount you've contributed every week for years, adjusted only slightly upward on those occasions when the household's fortunes have allowed a bit more generosity than usual. Your daughter watches this small ritual carefully, understanding, even at her young age, that this represents something important, a commitment that continues regardless of whatever else the week has demanded. You think sometimes about where this money travels once it leaves your hands, understanding in broad terms that it supports the church's operation, the minister's modest salary, the building's maintenance, but also extending further into the community in ways less immediately visible. The church maintains a small fund specifically for families facing sudden hardship, quietly distributed without publicity or embarrassment to whoever needs it most in any given month. And you know, without needing to ask directly, that some portion of your own faithful weekly envelope has likely at some point helped exactly this kind of quiet assistance reach a neighbour facing difficulty. This knowledge shapes how you think about the collection plate, transforming what might otherwise feel like a simple religious obligation into something closer to another thread in the same web of community support that includes Mrs. Delacroix's garden vegetables, the Hendersons' quiet loan during your own difficult winter, Mr. Sullivan's insurance premiums, all these small, faithful contributions weaving together into something larger than any single family could manage entirely alone. The minister mentions occasionally during his Sunday remarks the various ways the congregation's collective giving has supported specific needs throughout the community. A family whose home suffered fire damage, an elderly widow whose modest pension couldn't quite cover an unexpected medical expense, And you feel, hearing these updates, a quiet satisfaction, knowing that your own careful weekly envelope has contributed, in whatever small way, toward these larger acts of communal care. Your husband shares this same commitment, never once suggesting that the collection plate envelope should be reduced or skipped, even during your family's own harder stretches, understanding instinctively that maintaining this particular discipline matters precisely because it requires sacrifice rather than simply comfortable, painless generosity offered only when circumstances make it easy. As the service concludes and the congregation begins filing out into the bright Sunday morning, exchanging pleasantries and catching up on the week's small news, you feel the particular satisfaction that comes from having fulfilled this weekly commitment alongside every other careful obligation your household maintains. It sits alongside rent and groceries and coal in the notebook's careful columns, a modest but unwavering line item, evidence that your family's careful financial discipline extends beyond mere self-interest into something that actively considers and supports the wider community surrounding you. Walking home afterward, your children skipping slightly ahead, you think about how this particular habit, more than almost any other financial practice your household maintains, connects the careful, sometimes solitary work of managing a family's money to something larger and more genuinely meaningful. A reminder that all this patient counting and dividing ultimately serves purposes beyond simply your own family's comfort and security. And so the week closes the way it always closed, quietly, without ceremony, an envelope a little lighter, a notebook a little fuller, a family no richer than they were on Monday but steadier for having paid such careful attention. There was no drama in any of it. Just a kitchen table, a stub of pencil, a stack of paper worn soft at the corners, and two people who trusted each other enough to count out loud. Think for a moment about all the hands this kind of evening passed through. A grocer keeping a page just for your family. A banker who knew your children's names. A neighbour who appeared at the door with vegetables she claimed she couldn't use. None of them thought they were doing anything remarkable. They were simply living the way their own parents had taught them to live, patiently, honestly, one Friday at a time. There is something in that patience worth carrying into your own week, whatever shape it takes now. Maybe it is as small as counting out cash instead of tapping a card just once and feeling its weight in your hand. Maybe it is writing something down instead of trusting it to memory. Maybe it is simply slowing down long enough to notice the people who quietly hold your own life together, the way that whole neighbourhood once held each other's. So tonight, as you settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, think about the people who once sat exactly where you're resting now, tired from an ordinary week, grateful for an ordinary roof, trusting that tomorrow would arrive the same steady way it always had. They did not know they were nostalgia yet. They were just living, carefully, together. And that was enough. That has always been enough. Good night.